are actually increasing over time. So increasing the level of uncertainty. This is a general uncertainty, but you say this is what the OECD used to write in November 2022. So after the pandemic, for instance, the global economy is facing mounting challenges. So growth has lost momentum, high inflation is proving persisting, confidence weakened, uncertainty is high. So this was the scenario that we were living not so far away. I mean, just 2 years ago. Okay, and this is the European sentiment as well. So more or less it's the same exercise, but for European countries and magazines that have been text mined. And what you can see is clearly that the level of uncertainty, which is here measured year by year, but also quarter by quarter, is definitely increasing, especially after 2016. You clearly see in blue the shock generated by the Brexit in the UK, but then also you can see how, for example, countries like France, but also Germany, become particularly worried about this evolution of the global scenario, especially concerning the energy shocks or also policy shocks, that are going on, and the possible recession that Germany is experiencing nowadays. So the world is becoming more chaotic and uncertain, not only in general terms, but also think about trade. This is the trade policy uncertainty, particularly concerning the US. So we go on the other side of the ocean, and we clearly see again that after a more or less stagnant period until 2015, 2016, and not, let's say, it's not the case that this increasing uncertainty and turbulence is more or less corresponding to the Donald Trump's first elections in 2017, but also the previous electoral campaign in 2016, and all the announcements concerning Mexico or China and the rise of tariffs, and of course after 2018, let's say the trade war that occurred between the US and other countries such as China, but also European Union, Canada, Turkey, and so on and so forth. So you see that the level of volatility and also the level of turbulence is rising also in the US. You can have many of these, of course, indicators, but it's very interesting to see how the sentiment changed across time. So if you look at the keywords, okay, so the key concerns in more or less 20 years ago, from 2005, 29 up to 2018, you can also clearly see how the worry is changing in the US and in the advanced economies. So initially the concerns were mainly about taxation, border tax, export tax, tariffs and similar, whereas in 2018, so before also the pandemic, so the concern are mainly about trade wars, supply chain disruptions, and also the availability of raw materials. So you see the world is changing quite rapidly, because you should consider that everything is happening within a couple of decades, not a couple of centuries, but a couple of decades. Is this just to give you a flavor of why we need to look at this uncertainty? Because uncertainty is relevant because it affects, let's say, the ordinary business as usual of companies. Here I provided just a picture from a recent paper by Caldara and other 2019, published in the Journal of Monetary Economics, for example, where they actually examine how companies that are more or less concerned with this increasingly uncertain scenario record a more or less an average 2% drop in the investment in their capital stock, and this after more or less 1 year, as you can see from the graph. So this means that uncertainty, of course, as we know, is one of the fundamentals that drive, for example, investments, especially cross-border investments, but not only. And of course, this is detrimental for firms' activities. And this is just one of the examples, because investment in capital stock are very, very important for companies. On the other side, also on the eastern side, China, the situation for China is no better. So they also are rising concerns, and they also are rising the level of uncertainty, and they're increasingly worried about the situation. The situation is still exacerbated by the trade war, for example, but also the Brexit posed some, of course, concerns on Chinese people, but also the trade policy intensification because of Trump, but also Biden that did not reduce, did not change after things during his period as the president. And so wherever we go, we see that there is an increasing level of uncertainty and concerning, well, regarding the global scenario, the evolution of the global scenario, okay? So European Union, US, China, mainly. What is the context? Just a few words, just to give you an idea that why, so what is the main driver, let's say, of this uncertainty? Well, actually, well, many things happened in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years. So we should not forget, of course, where we come from. We come from a dramatic pandemic, of course, the Corona pandemic, but it's not only Corona. So even before, there were many, so the Russian-Ukraine war, of course, now the Israeli-Palestine war is exacerbating the international tensions across between countries. But don't forget also climate change and climate risk, which is very relevant, and the increasing number of natural disasters, which has huge implication and huge cost for all the economies in the world. But also, you know, artificial intelligence is the evolution, the recent technological progress is also launching many signals to policymakers, but also to, let's say, citizens and companies, entrepreneurs, who become very worried of the potential impact that these kind of technologies might have in the future, but also trade shocks, but also strikes, and many political also events all over the world that make us, of course, particularly worried about the evolution of the share. In this context, of course, a new global order seems to arise, right? So the new global order seems to be dominated by 2 major forces, okay? The US on the one hand, and China on the other. We can discuss about the emergence of other economies, but mainly these are the 2 main blocks. There can be a third one, perhaps India, which is rising quite fastly, but it's a very recent phenomenon. But I will show you some interesting historical evolution of these 2 countries. What about the EU? Question mark. Of course, the EU seems to be again taken between a rock and the hard mat and the hard stone, but still in between these 2 blocks, and doesn't seem to rise as a key leader in this battlefield. So some key questions arise. So the first is that, so why now? Why so are this geopolitical consideration, let's say, an issue now where they weren't so much some years ago, 10 or 20 years ago? Well, a suggestive answer comes from Ian Brenner, for instance. I like, this is a political scientist from the US, from the Eurasia Group, actually. So he speaks about the G0 world. So now we are used to talk about G20, you know, G7, G8, but actually he claims that the world is a G0 one. G0 means that there is a leadership. Yes, there is leadership, of course. There are many leaders, but it is not a global leadership as in the past. So this is his claim, and I agree basically with him, whereas now the world is made of confusion, and I add complexity. Okay, and this is the fact that I would like to discuss with you in this webinar. So what does it mean, basically? So what are the main, let's start from the main global power shift in recent history, of course. Let's go back to 1 century, for instance. So the century, so beginning of the 20th century until, let's say, World War II, so more or less was characterized by the so-called Pax Britannica. Well, the Pax Britannica is in the 19th century, but we can, let's say that also this period can be more or less compared with the Pax Britannica, where the UK was the main leader, especially thanks to its navy and military power. And after especially the Second World War, the power shifted to the US, definitely. Okay, the military power first, but also the economic and the political power to the US. So the period more or less between the 50s and the 90s is characterized by the Cold War, right? So 2 main blocks, the US dominating, but also USSR, until, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the period afterwards, more or less throughout the 90s and the first part of the new millennium, is mainly characterized by the US hegemony. okay? Whereas the period after, especially the financial crisis, is a period of confusion, as you will see, okay? Why do I say confusion, okay? Confusion because actually what you can see is the following. So UK dominated trade, for instance, from 1800 to, let's say, World War I. You can see from the graph on the right, which is taken from Richard Baldwin's Factual Fridays, just very nice, and I invite you to take a look at them. You see the share of the world exports until, well, the period between the two world wars. And you clearly see at the beginning that the UK in purple dominated the world. So he was more or less explaining 50% of the world export business, okay, at that time. But you can see that in a few years, it collapses roughly to 20%. And this occurs after the Napoleonic Wars because of the end of, for example, the reciprocal suppression of the trade, let's say, barriers imposed by Napoleon and actually in Great Britain, but also because of a rapid technological change in transport equipment favoring many other countries and not only England, and also, let's say, the end of the Civil War in the US that created a rapid industrialization of the US that actually in a few years reached a big overcapacity and export, let's say, competitiveness that replaced, let's say, the economic power of England. Okay, and you clearly see that the shift from the UK to the United States occurred mainly at the beginning of the World War I. Okay, whereas what you see in red on the left side, you see clearly China stagnating for the entire period. What happens afterwards? So from 1950 more or less to 2023, you see clearly that United States continued dominating until 2008 more or less. The role of England decreased steadily, but there is a rising actor that is definitely China, which in 2023 explained more or less 15% of the world export. Okay, so this is the picture. So now there seems to be a shift from the US to the UK. Why, sorry, to China. Why China stagnated before and emerged just in the last 10, 15 years? Well, first of all, because China loved autarky. So all the policies of the economic actions of China were guided by autarky, by the need to satisfy the internal demand, basically, a growing population, I would say, but also, let me say, also the so-called gunboat diplomacy of the UK that used to, let's say, dominate also China from the military perspective throughout the 19th and partly 20th century, not together with Japan and other forces. Okay, so this is basically why China was felt asleep for a long time. So now the world is changing, and the story was quite different in the past. This is very interesting because if you look, there are nice data from Angus Madison. If you look from year 1 or year 1000, for instance, and you look, for example, the population dynamics, you clearly see, please take a look at the graph, the up graph, you clearly see that India, that you see in purple, and China in green were definitely dominating the world. So they were explaining roughly 50% of the world population. Okay, and geography matters here, and the main reason is that, of course, the Asia was perhaps the best lively place where to live, actually, for population, for a human being. Before, of course, the urbanization occurred in Europe and in other places. So in terms of population, these two countries dominated. But as you can see from the bottom chart, this started, let's say, dropping with the beginning of the 19th century, and especially after the first and the second industrial revolution that occurred in the UK first, Great Britain, and then in mainly other G7 countries, if you want. And you see that there is a clear drop in, let's say, global GDP shares. So in year 1, you can see that China and India explain more than 50% of global GDP. So 50% of global GDP were created actually in India and China. Year 1000, more or less, we are at 43% or more than 40%. But then there is a clear decline after the 16th century, 17th century. And there was a drop actually in the 19th and 20th century. And now, just nowadays, there is an upsurge again of these two countries. So why the G7 and the UK specifically emerged as the new military, economic, and technological leaders at that time? Well, it's a story, it's a very interesting story, perhaps based on the building of an industrial base, or the manufacturing base in the UK. There are many nice books here by Joel Mokyr explaining what happened in the UK, for example, during the Industrial Revolution. So there's the scientific revolution, the technological revolution, but also the industrial revolution per se, which means a change in the manufacturing systems, a fall in the transport cost, an increase in efficiency and productivity, hand by hand with technological progress, which drove urbanization phenomenon and industrial agglomeration forces that in turn rose productivity, and so they started this virtuous cycle that explained the fortunes of the UK in that time, and Northern Europe in particular, but also partly of Italy as well, and Germany, the Netherlands, and the others. Whereas China and India did not experience this kind of phenomena, right? And they stagnated a little bit. I go very fast here because this is a rapid historical overlook, but let's say a key year is definitely 2001. I don't know if you remember or if you know who are these guys. This is the former president of China in 2001, together with Bill Clinton. This is year 2001, when Bill Clinton actually agreed to make China enter in the WTO. This is a key turn point in history. So December 21, which means mainly 2002, when Hu Jintao replaced the former president, and you clearly see that the role, the relevance of China, okay, and also in let's say in the export, in the international trade, increased exponentially up to 2022. Starting, let's say, a series of effects, particularly in the United States, that have been very well documented for many papers and many studies that look at the impact on the labor market, in particular, the negative impact in the labor market of the foreign trade competition from China. Well, I think that this, well, according to many analysts, this was one of the biggest mistakes in the history, actually, because you can read what Clinton was thinking about China. But I will come back to this, so keep in mind this period. But anyway, 21 is a crucial period because the level and the weight, the importance of international trade rose, and this is thanks to the entry in the WTO of this giant such as China. But also don't forget that 21 is also the first year where this globalization started becoming under attack, right? So it was the first big shock about globalization. So the attack to the Twin Towers is not the only one, let's say, but for sure, 21 is a very important year to the new millennium. And now what's happening now? So what's happening now? So let me come back to what I was meaning before, is that the global leadership is fragmented. This is the point. So it doesn't seem to be a global leader, but the US on one hand still keep the military and security dominance, if you want, but still no more the economic order. The economic order is not shifted to one specific element. So China and the emerging economies undermine for sure the US and the G7 economies, but they did not totally replace them. So on one hand, China remains the sole manufacturing superpower. And if I have time, I will show you some graphs about that. But still, the US and all the network, the alliances that the US had, especially in the economics and finance sphere, are still dominating. If we think about the hegemony again of the US dollar and the payment system, but also the financial markets, still the US dominates the world. Okay, so that's why we have confusion and we have a G0 world, as I told you before. A few words about what I was saying. I'm showing you some graphs about that. So if you see, for example, from the left chart, you clearly see that the US, the G7 on the one hand, but the US specifically are dominating from the military expenditure. Okay, this is the share of the total military expenditure from 1990 to 2022 by regions of the world. You clearly see that China and Russia are quite far away with respect to the US. The US alone is explaining roughly 40% of the world expenditure in military activities, okay? And the G7 more than 50%. On the other hand, China is definitely, as we have seen, starting from more or less 2007, 2008, dominating the manufacturing world. This is the share of the world gross output in manufacturing explained by these countries. You clearly see that the US is declining, whereas China is exponentially increasing, okay, over time. China's industrialization deserves attention because it is unprecedented, meaning that it was extremely rapid. Here's some information that you can read. China passed Germany in 1998 in manufacturing production, Japan in 2005, and the US in 2008. And China started in the 90s, becoming, let's say, relevant in the world in this respect. You see that, let's say, since 2008, China has more than doubled its world share, whereas the US has declined by roughly 3%. And to give you an order of ideas, the US replaced the UK in more or less 1 century. So from the early 19th century to early 20th century, whereas China has replaced the US in 15, 20 years. This gives you the speed of the replacement. And here you can see some evidence of how China is relevant, is the leader in manufacturing, both in terms of gross production and in terms of value added. The US are second, but still the role of China is even higher than the rest of the world once we take into account, of course, the main economies here. But you say the order of magnitude is absolutely astonishing, I mean. And you can also see from here, where especially on the right, you see that in 2020, China alone reached the same share, the same relevance of the top 10 economies excluding China. Now China surpassed the top 10 economies. This is a clear evidence that China is the only manufacturing leader. Another proof of that is that there is a clear asymmetry, for example, in the US-China dependencies. This is very interesting. If we look at the exposure to global value chains, for example, so the international supply chains, we see clearly from both graphs that from the left side, you see that is the input side, right? So it tells you how much the US relies on inputs coming from China, okay? Is the reliance of US manufacturers from components coming from China, okay, through global value chains. You see that this dependency is quite rising over time from mid-90s to 2020. Whereas the reliance of Chinese manufacturers from or on, let's say, US inputs is stagnating, if not declining over time. It means that China relies on US inputs much less than vice versa. But on the other hand, from the export side, on the right, you say that the China sales relies less and less from, let's say, US purchases, whereas US sellers, US exporters, if you want, rely more and more on China purchases. There is still a gap, as you can see from the right side, but still this gap is narrowing across time. But this is definitely also evidence that the two main economies in the world are highly interconnected. This is one of the main differences between the Cold War that occurred between the US and USSR. These were quite independent blocs, with the US clearly dominating USSR from many sides. Here, the story is completely different. It's completely different. Well, I have an iconic example to give you an idea, which is semiconductors. Well, Nokwanda, tell me, please, when I have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I don't know, I'm not keeping the time, okay? Semiconductors, microchips is a very iconic example, becoming smaller and smaller, but relevant and relevant over time. It has been estimated that from 2000 to 2022, the revenues rose, you see, by 3 times in billions of US dollars. But also, it has been estimated that more or less 800 production steps characterize the manufacturing of microchips. That can be summarized in 3 main phases. So the design, right, it is the earliest stage, manufacturing in the middle, and the final stage is the assembling and testing. All these stages are subject to increasing costs. And so many companies in the world became specialized in single steps of this value chain. But why do I want to tell you about semiconductors? Because they are very interesting about the fact, again, that China is rising its relevance from a manufacturing point of view, but still is not able to replace the economic power of the US. What is the reason? If you look at the value chain, let's say this is the sketch of the value chain of the semiconductors, you see that the earliest stages in the value chain concern research, the R&D, the design, the prototyping. Also, we have the manufacturing, and then you see assembly, testing, packaging, and also the distribution, let's say, of the microchips, of the buffers. You see that this is the value chain, but how is the value chain, let's say, governed? How is characterized at the global level? This is the global value chain. So stage by stage, you can clearly see what is the contribution of the regions of the main countries in the world. From top to the bottom, you see, you start with the earliest stages at the top, and you go on until the assembly, packaging, and testing, which is the downstream stage of the value chain. Well, I think there is one striking element here. So the blue bar is the US, the orange bar is China, whereas the gray one is East Asia, which means basically South Korea and Japan and Singapore and a few others. The rest is more or less negligible, but you clearly see that the earliest stages which are the most strategic, intangible, and value-added and high value-added activities are in the hands of the United States. Where does China emerge? China starts emerging in the downstream phase, the lowest value-added stages. Okay, material, buffer fabrication, and assembly and packaging, and more or less similar story as for other Asian economies, but with some differences with respect to China. You see, this is very, very illustrative. And to give you an idea of how the global value chain is, but if you look at the three areas at the bottom, the colored areas, so you see that basically the US and Australian part of Asia is dominating the earliest stages of production. It's a very globalized, let's say, good. Here are a couple of tables simply to show you how the export of these are diodes, transistor, and similar conductors, whereas the following is about the electronic integrated circuits. So the story is very similar. So you see, more than 20 years ago, so in 2001, Japan and the United States were the leaders, the export leaders. Whereas in less than 20 years, now we have China and Hong Kong, which means China, okay, of course, dominating, and which means Asia. If you look at the number of Asian countries here, you clearly see that they export a lot. But still, and the same is for the integrated circuit. So the story is very, very similar. And you see that the United States and Japan fell down after in 2021 with respect to 20 years before. But still, the story is very similar. So here I have another VUCLA, but I don't bother you. I don't think we have time to look at them, but if you want, we can take a look. But anyway, here, it was a nice exercise to show you that also a very simple good, such as the Barbie, also is subject to a very similar story. And if you look, for example, you see that all the parts, this is a relatively simple good with respect to the semiconductors, but you see that all the parts of the doll, from the mold to the hair, to the decoration, to the dresses, to let's say until the logistics and the distribution, are spread all over the world. Let's say it's a very globalized product. But if you look at the cost and profit, sorry, this is in Italian, but I hope you can understand, the cost of labor, which is mainly in China, and raw materials, which come mainly from Taiwan and Japan, explain just 10% of the value of a Barbie. So the final price is roughly $10, whereas $1 is the total labor cost and raw material cost. Whereas 90% of the costs come from post-production activities. So advertisement, marketing, insurance, transport, and many others, so 90%. But clearly you see that the profit, so the total costs are $9 per doll, more or less. This is a picture of some years ago, at least before the movie was released. So now the price is, I think, is a bit more expensive, perhaps, but this is an average price. So the profit for Mattel, which is the owner of the Barbie, is roughly $1 per Barbie. maybe you might think that this is not much, but please think that there are more or less 100 millions of Barbies sold each year, which means three per second, more or less. So you can, if you multiply $1 by 1 million Barbies each year, you can understand how big is the profit for Mattel. And this is just a rough estimation, let's say, of some years ago. So now maybe it's even more. But still, again, China here in the value added of the Barbie participate just for the lowest value added stages of production. Okay, so the contribution of China to the value added is not so high, let me say. The main part comes from the US and its main partners. The same is for the iPhone 4, for example. This is just another example. If you take what is the value of so the retail value was roughly $600 at that time. So iPhone 4 is quite old, though. iPhone 16 is just released yesterday. So, but anyway, this is just to give you a sketch of what I mean. If you see what is the contribution of China to the 600, let's say, dollars is roughly $6.54. So the reason is that China is manufacturing, but it's not contributing mainly to the inputs on the one hand, but also to the high value added stages such as advertisement, design, projecting. All these stages are mainly concentrated in the United States. So still the United States retain the largest part of the value added of this kind of products, which is sold everywhere in the world, right? So this is to give you an idea of, let's say, the interaction between the US and China, okay? How much time do I have, Nokwanda? I can hear you, but...
Sorry, I'm on mute. 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, I'll try to rush. Okay. I'll try to rush. Sorry, I want to simply show you some interesting dynamics for in GDP. Sorry, this is in Italian, but still, I hope you can understand. This is the GDP per capita. What you can clearly see is that US, EU, China, the GDP per capita are becoming richer, let's say, or wealthier over time. But still, there is a huge difference between GDP per capita in China for an average Chinese and an average American citizen, right? So it's quite huge, the difference, okay? The difference, of course, is this difference is different, okay? If you look at the growth rate of GDP in terms of dynamism, right? So China is much more dynamic than the US and the European Union. But still, please note that after 2006, 2007, the growth rate of the Chinese economy is definitely declining over time. It's still positive, but not so high as at the end of the 90s, beginning of the new millennium, okay? For sure, it's higher than in the US and in Europe, okay? But still, this is an issue. Population trends are very interesting because the population is rising in China until this year, 2023, where you see the growth rate of population fell below zero. It's a matter of fact that the European Union is the oldest region perhaps in the world. You see the share of population over 65 in the bottom left chart. But even if China registered the youngest population on average, still you can see from the graph that this population is becoming older. So also the dynamics are starting applying to China. Of course, it's much different, the story in terms of population density, where China dominates the US and the EU. But here, of course, again, sorry, this is in Italian, but here we are simply a magazine title saying that India, this is an historical overtake on China with respect to population. So you know that last year, India surpassed China in terms of population. So today, India is the most populated country in the world, okay? But I would like to stress the technological part even more, which is very, very interesting, I think. This global power shift are very interesting when we look at technology. So if we look, of course, it's very difficult to measure the innovative capacity of a country. We can have many different proxies, many different measurements for that. The most frequent, the most popular is using patent applications. Okay, of course, it's with many caveats, but if we look at the patent applications, we knew actually that until 2010, more or less, the US dominated together with Germany, European Union meaning Germany, basically. But you see that since 2016, 2017, the story is quite different because China is becoming the world leader also in patent application, the number of patent applications. Okay, you can say that part of this application are also together with European people and American people, right? But still, please consider the dynamics. So Germany is more or less stagnating. The US is rising, but quite steadily. The rise of patenting activity in China is striking, as you can see, it's exponential again. But this gives you an idea of the quantitative effort of a Chinese, let's say, patenting activity. But can we say the same in terms of the quality of technologies? There are many ways to measure that. One is the economic complexity. I don't know whether you are familiar with this concept. This is an approach developed by Ricardo Hausmann and Cesar Hidalgo in 2007, 2009, which measures actually the level of complexity of an economy, which is, let's say, the combination of two sides of the variety of products or patents, if we look at technology, that a country can produce or export successfully, let's say with a real comparative advantage, but also not only how many of them, but also how many of them are rare, are unique, so are difficult to imitate from the others. So if you produce, so it's not the case that, for example, an aircraft, which is an extremely complex product, is produced just by a few countries in the world, right? Because it's very complex and difficult to imitate. So if we average this level of complexity using international trade data on one hand or patent applications on the other, we clearly see that, let's say, China is quite far away. Even the US are not dominating, let me say, but still the US are more or less within the most, well, the top 10, 15, whereas China is not here. Well, there is Taipei, but it's, I mean, so small that it's not so relevant, let me say. Okay, so this is a first idea. And here you can see, this is, I plotted the index of economic complexity and of technological complexity, the first on the left and the second on the right, using trade data and patent data, respectively. And you see that Germany is a leader again, and you see that China is still lagging behind together with India with respect to the economic complexity. But still, please note that China and India are approaching with different speed, but they are approaching the leading economies that are Germany, US, France, and Italy, for example. And from the technological side, China is still, you see, it used to dominate more or less until 2010, but then its performance in the technological complexity is decreasing. What is this picture revealing? This is super interesting according to me. The matter of technological leadership, because still there are some key emerging technologies that are very relevant that we should analyze. Microelectronics, for example, the 5G, the artificial intelligence, and all the related technologies. And you see that these are battlefields for the US, China, and the EU, for example. It's not the case that the EU promoted the EU Chips Act, the US the Chips and Science Act, because they want to keep their own strategy, let's say industrial strategy, to develop this kind of technologies from the beginning, so from the raw materials until the end of the story. But the Chinese plan, the 5 years plan, the last 5 years plan, this is an idea that Xi Jinping has in its strategy, is to become the AI or the technological leader by 2030, more or less. And they're pushing forward to do that. The point is that there are many spheres of influence of China, from, you know, the networks, the critical raw materials, the Belt and Road, the military sales, whatever. China is gaining influence in these fields. It's not the leader, again, because the US are keeping mainly still the main leadership there, partly Europe, but I would say, but China is rapidly approaching to becoming the leader, as you have seen. Well, I don't take time, but this, of course, there are many issues related to this kind of leadership. China is actually, especially with his main companies, actually penetrating US and European economies, and this poses serious concerns, policy concerns and industrial concerns from these countries. But the missing point here is very interesting for me, is the invention deficit, what the analysts say, the invention deficit. So even if China recognized that science and technology are relevant, are crucial for the growth and the long-run development of the country, and to become a leader, not only from a technological, but also from a military and economic point of view, still the original inventive and innovative capabilities are relatively weak in China. The reason is that China is achieving a lot of results, let me say, is approaching quite fast in terms of the amount of patents and technology production, is becoming a leader, but still is not a leader because many of the core technologies are still in the hands of other countries, especially of the US. So where China is innovating is not in the core, let's say, disruptive technologies, but still its, let's say, innovative model is mainly incremental or is in areas where there is already a leader. This is the point. And you can see that in this respect, which is extremely useful, I think. This is taken from a paper by Wang and Huang, who are Chinese, actually. It's very, very interesting, but about some core technologies. Core technologies are, let's say, still measured through patent application, but are technologies that are emerging in terms both of quantity of patents submitted, but also in terms of cross citations, okay? These are very relevant technologies. Well, you see artificial intelligence dominating, but also Internet of Things, cloud computing. So these are the industry 4.0 or 5.0 technologies mainly. And if we cluster countries according to this matrix, where we measure the quantity of patents, of patent application by a country, but also the quality of the patent application, which usually are measured through the citation, okay, the forward citation, so how much time these patents are cited by other scientists, by other patents, you can frame 4 types of countries. So you have a technological leader, where both quantity and quality are high, so above the average, so to say, but also you have technology latecomers on the opposite, where there is low quality and low quantity. And in the middle, we have potential competitors, few patents, but highly cited with high potential, and technology activism, where you have a lot of patents, but still not very cited, okay? Which means that technology are still not so relevant, okay, if we want. Well, very interesting. So keep in mind this matrix and look where the US and China position themselves in this framework. In this framework is the following. So let's look at the key technologies here, for example, information transmission, wireless communication, and communication equipment. On the right, you can see the leading companies, but please look at the left charts. The US is the one with the blue circle, the big blue circle. China is the red one. China is never a technology leader. US is always in a technology leadership position. Is it a matter of technology? No. Please take a look at semiconductor, photoelectric technology, chemical gas processing. China is negligible here, the role of China. Still, US or Japan are dominating the scene. Other 2 types of group of technologies: general data processing, special data processing, information security, information transmission. Still, China, negligible or still as a technology activist, whereas the US is still dominating there. Something seems to happen in identification and intelligent control technologies, but still we cannot say that China is a leader. Okay, these are key technology, core technologies, where still the US is playing the role, the main role. What is the reason for that? The main reason is that still, if we believe R&D, of course, is the main inputs in generating this kind of technologies and patents, China is still lagging behind with respect to the US, both in terms of the amount or the share of resources devoted to public R&D, which are increasing a lot. They are increasing a lot, but still, even if the US trend is declining, but still, we are talking about an investment which is of a double size from the US with respect to China. And this is only the public side of the story. The private side is where this difference is becoming even more striking. You clearly see that Chinese companies are not investing enough in business or private R&D as the US counterparts. The US is investing much more in absolute and in relative terms in R&D with respect to China. Needless to say, Chinese companies, especially state-owned companies, are very inefficient, and R&D in China is, let's say, characterized by high level of bureaucracy that also make it still not so efficient as in the US. I don't know if I have time to go on because I have other things, for example, raw materials, story. Otherwise, I can skip to the conclusion. As you prefer, Nokwanda, please tell me.
I think, Prof, you can continue because from a raw materials perspective, we might have the audience they would like to understand around the industrialization aspect, because that's where we're trying to get to as Africa. And if that's what we need to do,
Okay, so 5 minutes to describe the raw material story. Why raw materials are becoming very important, I think we all know. So we are living this digital and green transition phase. Yesterday, Mario Draghi in the European Union provided this EU competitiveness report, stressing that European Union needs to invest a lot of money really, and also in this digital and green transition. But to do so, we need technologies. These technologies are only partly immaterial, but many of these technologies, so data centers, computers, electronic systems, but also renewable energy transformation systems are material and rely on a very material base. Okay, so they need to be manufactured, and of course, manufacturing requires raw materials. And these raw materials are not, as you know, evenly distributed in the world. And this uneven distribution implies a lot of geopolitical tensions and a shortage and tight supply condition. During the pandemic, I think we experienced this kind of problems at the company and the country level. Of course, this also affects commodity prices as well, that rose a lot, giving rise also in turn to the energy crisis that we all know. So what is the role of this, especially the critical raw material, not all the raw material, but critical raw material, let's say, in the twin transition? So to what extent do modern technology utilize these critical raw materials? And especially the green technologies, okay? And who is providing these raw materials? What is the global scenario here? So let me show you something that comes from, I will cite the sources later. This is just to give you an idea of how much, starting from the 90s, the extraction of these raw materials increased over time. Much of the extraction comes from Africa, we know, especially, I don't know, Congo, to mention just one. But you see that many of these kind of are increasingly provided and supplied over time. Here, other, selenium, vanadium, I mean, these rare metals and critical raw materials all over the years. This is the extraction, okay? This is the trends in the extraction of these raw materials. But to what extent are these raw materials relevant for our technologies? To do so, I mean, here I mentioned Lee et al. Paper 2023 published on research policy. If you take patent application that are the proxy for measuring our technology, and you run a text analysis, okay, on the claims and the abstract of the patents, and you identify among the keywords, okay, these critical raw materials, you can see this picture. This is the number in blue, and in red, the share of patents with at least one raw material mentioned in its claims in the text of the patent. You clearly see that there is an increasing trend, and please look that the number is definitely exponentially increasing after 2007, 2008. You know, this is very, very important. So it means that our technology, especially our most recent technologies, rely more and more and more on critical raw materials. The example of the gallium also is very right. So it's replacing tungsten, let's say, as a main technology for lights, right, for lighting. And here is an example. So the role of tungsten in patent application is declining over time, whereas the role of gallium as a substitute, let's say, raw material for substitute technology is increasing over time, especially in the most recent years. But this gives you also another idea. Okay, this is the idea why we need gallium, right? Because the lighting system is changing, not only for, let's say, the residential activity, but also think about cars, for example, and the new machinery. This is the reliance on critical raw materials by technology field. So taking patents from these technological fields here, you see the absolute numbers on the left, the relative number, the shares on the right. Still, you see chemistry and electrical engineering are the domains that consume, let's say, CRM more intensively. But what is very relevant, I think, is the next picture concerning, let's say, which are the most frequent critical raw material used in green technologies. So photovoltaic panels, wind turbines, and so on and so forth. Okay, and this kind of renewable energy. So the technologies that are needed for the green transition rely heavily on this kind of raw materials. Okay, of course, silicon for sure, but also aluminum, copper, which are traditional, but also look at lithium, of course, very well for the batteries, zinc, and whatever. What is the story here? We know that, again, the extraction of these raw materials is not evenly distributed again. Look at the evolution of the presence of these critical raw materials over time, starting from 98, 2000 until more or less today, 2013, 2017, on a 5-year interval, which are the emerging raw materials. So lithium and silicon are dominating, but please look at copper, phosphorus, zinc, graphite, titanium. Many others are increasing over time. And this relates only the green technology domains. Okay, even green, so this means that to pursue this kind of green transition, we need raw materials, and we strongly need raw materials, I would say, because if we look and compare the patents in the renewable energy domain with respect to all the other technologies, we see that the former requires the use of critical raw materials the most. Okay, so we are producing technologies today that should favor the green transition, that rely heavily on critical raw materials. This is the paradox, okay, of our times. And I think you all know what are the social and environmental consequences of extracting this kind of raw materials, okay? But very interestingly, what are the countries involved? If you look at the network of the countries involved, is the following. So on the right, you see the countries that mainly extract these raw materials, where you see in red countries that come from developing, let's say, economies. So Argentina, you see India, you see Zambia, Turkey, Chile, whatever. Then you see in the middle the symbols of the raw materials, manganese, silicon, cobalt, etc. And then you see the network of the patents. These are the green labels, the labels of the green patents. The patents are concerning green technologies. So you can see which of these green patents use this kind of raw materials. You can, for example, see that there are some key raw materials that we have seen before, such as silicon or lithium, where the number and the density of links is particularly high. But then you can also link these technologies with the using countries. And you have many countries. So the number of countries that use this technology, that in turn use this raw material, is much larger than the countries producing these raw materials. But you can see that the key countries are clearly advanced economies, right? Or fast emerging economies, such as, again, China or Korea. That gives you an idea, or the dependency of these countries, not only so directly from the green technology, but indirectly from the raw materials required to produce the technologies, and again, in turn, from the countries producing these materials. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because now there is a strong emphasis on the so-called strategic autonomy in the industrial policy, especially in Europe, where strategic autonomy means trying to rise the independency of the European Union from, for example, the US, but also from China, also from other countries, in providing its own raw materials, in the extraction and process of raw materials. This is the point. And here we are demonstrating this can be the case. And I mean, this was not an issue until 4, 5, 6 years ago, but after the pandemics and the trade war, this became a serious issue today. Okay, I don't have time to speak about the monetary leadership. Of course, there are many issues concerning, let's say, the role of dollars versus the renminbi. There are problems related to institutions. But please, I would like finally to stress that China, and I would like to go to one final slide, China and the US, which are the big leaders today, are, again, highly interconnected economies that, of course, are characterized by many, like I say, many fights, but also many cooperation deals. Okay, they cooperate and they deal, they have a lot of business one with each other. The scenario to avoid this is the one. Okay, this is my end point I would like to talk about. Do you have an idea who is this guy here? He comes from ancient Greece. This is Thucydides.
He looks Greek.
Yes, he was actually Thucydides. Okay, and do you know what the Thucydides trap is? This is the scenario we should avoid. This is a concept developed by Graham Allison in 2017, which is a fantastic book about that. The Thucydides trap is a sort of tendency towards war when we have two powers, an incumbent one, which was which was Sparta at that time, but now it's the US, which feels threatened by an emerging one, a rapidly emerging one, such as Athens in the ancient Greece, China today. It shows many episodes through history, and in the major part of the episodes, military war was the end point. In Europe, but also outside Europe, he documented many episodes where actually the hegemonic, let's say, power, instead of, let me say, accommodating or dealing with, diplomatically perhaps, with the emergence of a second power, they prefer to stop, turn themselves, and fight against the emerging economy. You can see the consequences. Are we risking this kind of scenario? Probably not from a military perspective, although we have to be very careful, because many wars started because of accidents, okay? And we have many areas of the world where the tensions are very high. Think about Taiwan, for example, just to mention one. But still, this is the scenario, according to Fitch, US, that probably will occur in the following years. We can have a G2 scenario, from G0 to G2, let me say, so a new power sharing between the two, which means that the two leaders will, let's say, share the power in the world. You can have a second scenario where there will be the Chinese hegemony, especially in Asia, and this will be tolerated by the US. You can have a third scenario with a US renaissance and the Chinese system collapse. Maybe not so probable, but please consider that China is undergoing a strange situation at home with this excess capacity that needs to be accommodated and exported, but also with this, with problem with the housing system. Whereas we will see about US Renaissance, the new elections, what will happen, or there can be a new Cold War, which seems to be at the current scenario. Let's see, but in many cases, actually, the two economies actually collaborate. I leave you just here all the rest, and I would say, sorry, I go to the last slide simply to tell you, thank you for listening. Oops, sorry. I leave you my contacts here. Thank you for listening, and if you have questions, of course, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for such an insightful, knowledgeable, and powerful presentation. I had myself writing, I must have written more than 10 pages of notes, just thoughts and questions. Like, my main question is, what does this mean for developing economies? I'm sure it's going to happen, like regional disparities, social impact. And as a continent, and I am based in South Africa for our participants that may be joining in from other African countries or across the world, there's a huge drive. Like, we all know that Africa hasn't fully industrialized and, you know, realized its potential. And I see your slides and you speak of the raw materials, and it seems to me like there's more innovation that drives economic growth. And not necessarily in terms of technology, but in terms of, like you say, like creating new products from the patent point of view. And also with the analogy, I mean, this all ties in together. The analogy of the Barbie, where the unit costs for some of the inputs, let's say, for example, in Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, were minimal. But like you said, it's the US that carries most of the revenue from the marketing and advertising of products. So as a country that has not even, I mean, as a continent that hasn't even achieved the pinnacle or even just the baseline of its economic potential, but still wanting to, still driving this raw material agenda. We're still very agricultural, but I don't see agriculture in any of your graphs. What does that mean in terms of how we then, you know, shape our direction firstly? And what do the current and the scenarios that you've painted mean for developing countries in terms of disparities and adverse, or maybe positive social impact?
Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, I'm making some mistakes here. I would like to show you one of the slides that I couldn't present, which is here. Mainly, okay, concerning, well, of course, I expected your questions, in the sense that I know that my presentation was so far mainly centered on advanced economy perspective and China, on the other hand. What about developing countries? First of all, let me say the answer is complex. The main reason is that when we talk about developing economies, we tend to pull them all together, but they are very different countries, very different stories and probably growth scenarios, okay? For example, Asian economies are more or less close to China. Of course, I'm excluding Japan and Korea, but many of these Asian economies are benefiting from, let's say, being neighbor of China. And I think that China is leading and will lead their development for other few years, for example. This is, and also many of them benefit also from being part in global value chains. Think about, for example, Vietnam. I think is a very iconic example. So Vietnam 20, 30 years ago were fully agricultural and very poor country. Well, in 20 years, because of mainly foreign direct investments from US and Europe, and partly from Asia, it developed its industrial base, of course, driving also population and urbanization dynamics. And so income per capita started rising, export-led growth, openness to trade, all this policy and industrial aspect helped this country to rise. And so today, Vietnam is a very promising country, okay? It's an emerging economy, although it is very small as compared to the standard BRICS, for example. But what about, so there are also other interesting African countries that are emerging. Well, Nigeria, although Nigeria is very big. Well, South Africa, we know, is already there. I mean, it's perhaps the most developed, at least in the sub-Saharan area. But also we have other countries, Egypt, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia also benefited a lot from being part of the global value chain, especially with respect to Europe, so proximity to Europe. But needless to say, many African economies are actually the basing of, let's say, raw materials extraction. And I'm not scared to say that China, of course, is exacerbating. So China is playing a double role there. So it's investing a lot of money, building infrastructures, helping perhaps some African regions to rise their level of development. But on the other hand, this is also, you know, exploiting the natural resources of Africa. This is an issue that, of course, I'm not telling here, but there are many studies about that and policy concern and debate about that. this is an issue, but I don't think this issue will stop. But what we are doing now, we are definitely entering a new stage of the world. The new stage is a stage where the G7 countries are definitely deindustrializing, de-agriculturizing. They already did it in the past. So agriculture now in the advanced economy is playing let's say, a minor role in terms of employment and also value added. So much of the agricultural value added and production come from developing regions, also for climate reasons, but also for production reasons. Maybe advanced economy increase their efficiency in agricultural production, but still in terms of extensive and intensive production, we can say that it's not Europe or, well, the US still, because the US and Canada are very large countries as well, but also main part come from China, come from Asia, come from Brazil and South America and Africa. But still we are entering the era of service trade. So services are the key zone. And in service activities, what is clearly here an emerging trend is the following. Talk about export of services such as financial services, but also transport services and travel and tourism, for example. Here we can say that still developed countries are driving, let's say, are leading the role. I mean, they're exporting the most part of this kind of services, whereas China and India, for example, and the rest of the world are still a minority of the story. But if you look at the trends on the right, you see that the growth rate of emerging economies, the growth rate, okay, is now overtaking that of the advanced economies. So what I do expect in the future is, for example, a fast rise of China and India, at least in this respect. Will this help the other countries? I think so. I think that in the next 10, 20 years, even the other economies in the world will develop their service base. But if you believe in a sort of, like can I say, evolutionary process of growth and development, of course, before arriving to services, you start from agriculture, then you move to heavy manufacturing, then to smart manufacturing, then you go into services, from traditional to the advanced and knowledge-intensive services. Many African countries are still considered least developed countries, where agriculture still played a major role, and they're very poor countries. So still the role of agriculture will be there. They will become more developed if they will be able to attract manufacturing activities first and then service activities. Will this take place? Well, according to a certain scenario, yes. So Africa is considered, let's say, the Asia of the future, what Asia was actually 10, 20 years ago. Maybe the main reason is because we are exploiting all the world, and Africa is remained, let's say, the place where there are more business opportunities. But still, my take is that it shouldn't be exploitation. This is the point. So far, it's mainly exploitation. This is a pity. But what Africa needs is a stimulation of the indigenous resources. So attracting capital, getting experience by getting in touch with foreign capital, improving the institutional quality. This is crucial. The level of institutional quality is crucial for attracting and keeping, for example, foreign investors, and for attracting good investments. This is a crucial point. So decreasing corruption, favoring rule of law, making regulation transparent, property rights protection, and many things that can be done. This is the place, and they should attract manufacturing. Well, if the things will go on as expected, manufacturing will not be so more, convenient in Asia. Still, the average wages are increasing in China very rapidly. The story is very similar to Eastern European countries that still are attracting activities, but they also are building high-tech competencies in this respect. So this is what Africa can do, actually, attracting manufacturing, develop its own industrial base, and diversifying the portfolio of its activities, manufacturing first, and then moving to services. How much time will it take? I don't know. It's very difficult to predict that one. It also depends on how China and the US will, suck all the energies, all the resources in the world.
Thank you, Prof. We do have a few questions. We have a question in the chat and a hand. I think, Bandi, you can go. I will read the question in the chat when you're done. Bandi, your hand is up. Not sure if you can hear me. Okay, I'll just read the one in the chat while Bandi connects. Yes. It says, how can we minimize the impact of disruptive technologies, particularly in relation to business models and employment? I'm not sure if Anonymous would want to give context to his question. Or is it
well,
clear?
The point is, what do we mean by minimizing the impact? In which respect? In employment terms, maybe?
Yeah, they say very difficult. Business models and employment, I would assume, unless Anonymous you'd like to speak, you can.
Well, the point, why do we need to minimize the impact also? This is my counter question. Let's say, in the history of technology, this impact has never been minimized. So to say, we have been, how can I say, hit by technological waves, and companies were entrepreneurs, particularly, at least if you have a Schumpeterian perspective, as I have, let's say that the entrepreneurs plays a major role in not only innovative, but also in spreading innovation. So, of course, AI, if perhaps I interpret correctly, and similar technologies and related technologies, which are actually driving this new digital revolution, of course, are scaring many economies. But that here the point is to regulate this kind of. There are many concerns, many worries about the potential impact of AI. Not only the ethical impact on one hand, but also the regulatory. The impact on regulation and the impact on societies as well. Think about privacy issues, think about also substitution with employment, not only the, let's say, blue collars, but also white collars employment. These actually are an issue, but this is a process that should be governed correctly. It's a matter of governance. The European Union has started regulating. Let's see whether this will work, because actually this has been adopted just a few months ago, so it's too early to see. But I think that so far, if you look at the data, so far at least, this kind of technology don't seem to be so pervasive in companies. Think please of the fact that the major part of the companies in advanced economies are small and medium kind of or micro enterprises that are. For them, it's very, so they're not multinationals, right? They're not large companies, okay? Of course, large companies are the leaders and are the suppliers many times, okay? Sorry, they are the leading companies in the supply chain. But still, many of the small and medium enterprises are not adopting this kind of advanced technology. So probably when they will do it, they will be so mature that the governance of these technologies will be already on stage, so to say, and they will be safer than today. I'm not really sure that AI will replace, of course, partly it will replace jobs or some kind of jobs, but I'm more optimistic from this perspective. I think that it will be a complementary kind of technology rather than fully substitute. And the data and the analysis we have so far seems to go in this direction. We don't have strong evidence of massive unemployment generated by robots or by AI systems. So still we are exploring this kind of technologies, and still the general purpose potential of these technologies is not unveiled at 100%. So I think it's too early to talk about that, but I don't see such a urgent need to reduce, let's say, the impact of this technology. Let's see what happens, but I think that we have all the tools, especially in the advanced economies, to govern these processes.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions? I see Bandi's hand is still up. I'm not sure if he's disconnecting and reconnecting to this webinar. Are there any further questions from the floor before we close out? I do have just one last one that maybe we can wrap the session. It's just to ask, is it possible to replicate or adopt the Chinese growth model? I hear a lot of people always say, China got it right, so we should follow what China did. They focus on manufacturing. And I don't personally believe that's possible, but I think each country needs to figure out what they're good at and align that to obviously what's happening, particularly when it comes to global value chains, because it seems that exports is what seems to be driving most growth for these high growing economies. But what would your closing thoughts be on that?
Perhaps the only country that can try to imitate is India, for one very simple reason: size. Size. So China, well, of course, if you talk about again, Vietnam, Singapore, or small African economies, maybe, I don't know, Ghana, I don't know, because there are requests, or Tunisia, again, of course, I can tell you there are many growth opportunities for them, but there's a totally different story with respect to China. China is not only a story of growth and development, it's a story of dominance. There is also many cultural aspects that are behind that, and also the vision that the leaders have. You should know the history of China, of course, which is different from the history of India, for instance. The relationship of India with the Western world are much tighter than those of China. So there is today there is a strong desire of Chinese leaders to emerge as the future leader, replacing especially the US as the Western world. I don't know whether India has. India, of course, is rapidly growing, is expanding a manufacturing base. I don't know whether India, I'm rather skeptical about that, will reach the same performance of China at the end of the 90s, the beginning of 2000. But it's a matter of fact that India is emerging as a new potential leader. But still, China has some other characteristics that India doesn't have. Also the, let's say, the trade balance, the ownership of assets of foreign countries, especially from the US, something that India doesn't have, for example. But still, India has some rooms for trying to partly imitate the manufacturing performance of China, but still, I don't see it. The other reason is that there is China yet. So when China grew, there wasn't a developing economies like China. But now India is growing where China is already there. And so many business opportunities are already taken by China, so to say, okay? So it's very difficult to, let's say, compete for India with not one, but two big leaders such as the US and China. Okay, this is the main point. But still there is room for growing. For all the other economies, I don't see the chance for growing in the same way as China, which is a surprisingly, let's say, story of growth and development.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof.
You're welcome.
Let's try and give Bandi one last chance. Bandi, your hand is up. Do you want to say something?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay,
greatly appreciate this. Yes, I have two questions. One, to Prof. On the issue of China, with the growth of their population and their production, what still keeps U.S. economy, more specifically their GDP, in a very high rate? Then secondly, you spoke about India being a potential, whether I got the right word, whether emerging superpowers. Beyond aside their population growth, what other factors do you think they are doing or is taking place in India which will influence such a position you are making? Thank you.
Well, Bandi, I didn't get the first question. Sorry, if you can repeat it, because I heard that something about related to the GDP of China.
Yes. With the first question, I'm saying that if you look at China, they have a high production. In fact, per the graphs you've shown, and then a growth population as well. So with these two factors, what still keeps U.S. GDP very high? I mean, it still gives you yeah.
Okay, I think I get the point. Okay, let's start from this first point. So the first point, yeah, of course, well, population dynamics drive GDP dynamics. So we're talking about, in this respect, that, well, population and also labor force, of course. So the level of employment, which is also collinear with the level of urbanization, because we have many episodes, there's a massive migration from rural areas to urban areas in China. especially from the inner part of China to the southern and the coastal part of China, because we talk about China, where we have many different Chinas within. So the regions of China, which are huge, have a very different performance one with respect to the other. But then this increasing population and labor market dynamics over time also drove the level of GDP. So China started producing, and now China is, the main issue of China is now is overcapacity. So China is producing more than it's able to consume, especially, and this is huge production because the level of population is, billions of people. But the point is GDP per capita, that's the real point. We should not look at GDP, which we know that overcame that of the US, if I'm correct, in value terms, but still is GDP per capita. So if we take GDP per capita, then it's increasing over time, which is a good sign for Chinese people, but still with respect to other economies, such as the US or even Italy or France, wherever, it's much lower. Okay, that's the main point. Of course, the picture I show you is an average. If you take, of course, the distribution is quite skewed because you have of course, if you take Hong Kong, Taiwan, you see the level of the average income per capita is even higher than that in Europe or in the US. But if you take the whole China, including the inner areas, of course, the level of GDP per capita is much lower because there are many, many poor areas of China. Although they are improving a lot, now the 5G is almost everywhere, even in the countrysides. But maybe in a few years also the level of GDP per capita will increase, which is a size of the efficiency, let's say, of production of the labor force. Concerning India, I would say that the main force, well, is a very interesting story because it's mainly driven again by manufacturing. But it's not only manufacturing production. Manufacturing is not only for, let's say, internal purposes, but manufacturing is stimulated first by GVC dynamics. So attraction of foreign direct investments, especially from advanced economies, from the US, from Europe. So they attracted a lot of FDIs, and this helped them to start producing. They also invested in human capital. And so they are able, this is different from China, for example. I think that this is a source of comparative advantage for China. They are already advanced in the provision of services, advanced services, medical services, financial, engineering. These kind of services are provided by India. Of course, many Indians study in the US, for example. So it's a choice of collaboration with the US and with other European partners. And so they got their expertise by interacting with advanced economies. That's true. There's a matter of FDI attraction, development of human capital. And so FDI attraction not only in manufacturing, but also in advanced services. This is the main story. Don't forget that these economies, I didn't tell it, but China first, but also India, they also have monetary policy power. They have autonomy. So they can also depreciate their currency also to favor exports. This is what China did actually in the past, and that's why I'm rather skeptical that they want to become a monetary leader from this respect and replacing the dollars, for instance. But this is the story of India. It's still again moving from manufacturing to advanced services. They are at the beginning perhaps, but they are developing very fast in this respect. Again, the point is that these economies are very large, very heterogeneous inside. So there are many developed areas. Think about Bangalore, think about the south of but there are many other poor regions. And so pay attention when you look at the average statistics, as I did for reason of time. But if we look at the distribution of wealth within these countries, it's very uneven. And this is an issue, of course. This is one of the biggest issues. But still, for sure, it will be the leaders of the future. So I do expect India to rise even more in the next years. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for at least we have this recorded so we can always access it when we need it, especially maybe some of the participants here may want to maybe take some of the themes and maybe do a research, maybe for their honors or masters or PhD, which is also the reason why we have the webinars that we have to drive different thinking. around ordinary topics or known topics. So we have come to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much. This is not the end of our relationship. We do believe in long-term relationships, so we are still open to any collaborative collaborations that you might have, whether through your university or your department. We are also looking at having student chapters, having YGES on campuses. And if you maybe have the appetite, or one of your students may have the appetite to connect with other young scholars across the globe, from Africa to Asia Pacific, the US, please do connect us with them. And also to the participants, if you are interested also to be part of YGES, please do follow us on our LinkedIn page, and you'll be kept up to date with all the information and that will be running this year. Going into the next year, we have very exciting plans planned for the year. And if you would also, if you are in university and you would like to also open a student chapter, or maybe just be a part of YGES, do reach out to us as well. So we do believe in long-standing relationships. It's not just a once-off, and we do believe in organic and relationships that have synergy between the two organizations. So Prof, we do look forward to engaging with you further. If you have any ideas, you can drop me an email. We can take it up with the team, and we can see how we put something together, be it a conference, a seminar, whatever it is that, you know, may come to your mind, or if you know anyone within your network that would be interested in working with an organization like us, please do reach out to us. You have my number, and yeah, thank you so much. Please do share your slides to my email address, and yeah, I'll manage that distribution.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you still have appetite for one question. I see Brighton's hand is up. Brighton, see his hand is up. Would you like to say something? Okay, please. Okay, hold on. He wants to be unmuted. Okay, hold on, Brighton. Give me a moment. Okay, there you go. Hi, Brighton. I've unmuted you. You can speak.
Should unmute.
Go ahead.
I can't hear anything.
Activity is not great, but I have unmuted you, so you should be able to.
Maybe he can write something, maybe?
Yes, you can type also in the chat. Okay, I'm not sure. Oh, well. We are very sorry, Brighton. We don't know what's happening on your end. I'm sure Prof was looking forward to your question or comment, but that's okay. Anything else, you can just connect with us via our social media pages, and we'll take it up with Prof if it is something that you wanted to speak to Prof about, if you can hear me. Yeah, okay. All right then. Thank you everyone for your participation and your presence. Have a very good day. We will be having these webinars every month, so connect with us and stay informed.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.